Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in Paul and the Faithfulness of God by N.T. Wright. We've already had a few lessons that were like key markers in the development of Paul's theology by N.T. Wright, and we should be aware of the fact that these pages from 645 to 665, these 20 pages are another key moment in the development of thought by N.T. Wright. And the key new item that's being posited here and is critical for us to understand is that Professor Wright tells us that for Paul, there was not a separation of doctrine between Christology and Eschatology. There was not, in systematic theology, there was always a separation of doctrine between Christology and Eschatology. Professor Wright tells us that in the case of Paul, there was no separation between Christology and Eschatology. This is a man who lived crucified in Christ. He said that he no longer lives, but Christ lives in him. And Professor Wright reminds us that for Paul, his Christology was not separated from Eschatology. They weren't two separate areas of doctrine. And additionally, Professor Wright wants us to remember that the early church, prior to Paul's conversion, already had a Christology already formed. It was a Christology centered around the concept of wisdom. What Paul did is take that proto-Christological doctrine that the church had, and he applied eschatology to it. Paul applied eschatological categories to the already existing wisdom Christology, and then by doing so, he also applied an eschatological theme along with those categories and concepts, and so Paul basically imprinted the early church Christology of wisdom with an eschatological and Exodus-shaped imprinting, which made his early Christology as a high Christology a very powerful and influential doctrine of the emerging church. And this is a new teaching from Professor Wright, so we're very grateful that we have this teaching. We get to look at a Christology that is not separated from eschatology. In fact, to do so would actually be an improper way to mark out Paul's theology. So having made those preliminary comments, let's take a look at the triad on the left. Let's take a look at the birth of Paul's Christology as, first of all, dealing with the terms that were already existent within first century Judaism and first century Christian church. Then we begin with the concept of Kyrios Lord, which was posited by Paul. His Christology certainly said that Jesus Christ is the Kyrios Lord of heaven and earth. That was drawn from the Septuagint use in the Judaic faith of Yahweh as Lord, and Paul equated his concept with that prior notion. He did therefore use Jewish sources, his own Jewish education, and especially he did take up the concept of Yahweh as Lord and let that imprint his thought, his reflective thought, in shaping his Christology. But we already learned in an earlier lesson that he always took every thought captive and measured it against Christ, and so he did take these contributions from Judaic faith and early Christianity. He did do his own reflective work, his own reflective measuring against Christ before formulating his own Christology. And if you look at note 2 in block 1, it must be recognized that Christology was never an issue of contention between Paul and the Jerusalem believers. That was never an issue of contention. So the proto-existing Christology was not anything that conflicted with Paul's thought. He could actually take it up and imprint it with his eschatological categories and his thematic imprint of Exodus. But there was no conflict, no contention in the area of Christology between Paul and the Jerusalem believers. So if you look at block 2, he did take up an already given proto-Christology in the early church. So the first comment that Professor Wright makes is that Paul's Christology is not simply Damascus Road Apocalypse. It is not only Damascus Road Apocalypse. It most certainly is that, but it also draws on additional contributions, and those contributions are the Son of Man language that was used by Christ himself, the already existing early Christology by the church, and for Paul also, the ecclesia experience of worship and prayer also was a contribution to his reflective thought on his Christology. But eventually he did move into casting that Christology into language, and he did so as a noema design, or a noema pattern. And we have to understand the Greek concept of noema, because Paul, in the verse we've already discussed, when Paul said, I took every thought captive, he used noema. And that means he took every design model of the kingdom captive and measured it against Jesus Christ. And so what we need to understand here is that when Paul took up the proto-Christology already in existence in the early church, he took it up and critiqued it against his understanding of Jesus Christ, and he formed his own noema design for his Christology. And because it is a design, it's a design in an eschatological framework. So let's move on and look at block 3. We've got this taking captive of the already existing noema designed Christologies that were in existence, but then through reflective work reaching his own casting into language of his own Christology. It was, for Paul, always relational. It's a relational doctrine, because Yahweh was always disclosed as covenant relation, and therefore Yahweh as Lord, which he equates with Christ as Lord, he takes up that same relational aspect. Christ as Lord is understood as a lordship in relation with creation, a lordship in relation with the ecclesia church. So Paul's Christology must be articulated within the relation, the dialectical relation between the lordship of Christ and the fellowship of the ecclesia called out ones. And so for Paul, concepts like logos, word, or Sophia, wisdom, or gnosis, or the angeloi, these were not entities, they were relational categories for Paul in shaping his noema designed Christology. And he abbreviated it under his monotheistic faith. As a Judaic believer, he did not abandon monotheism. He instead kept the aspects of the creational and the eschatological and the cultic aspects of monotheism, but then equated them with the divine identity in Christ. Christ is the agent of new creation, where all things become new, where all things are reconciled, where all things are moving eschatologically in a noema designed Christology, in an eschatological framework. So Paul's Christology is relational, it is monotheistic, and it is heavily imprinted also with the notion of the return of Yahweh and the return of Yahweh's doxa glory to Israel, who happened to be under an elongated exile under Roman oppression. This is why Paul's Christology had to be a thematic Christology of Exodus eschatology, because for Paul, the apocalyptic unveiling of Christ on the Damascus Road revealed to him that doxa glory had returned. The doxa glory of Yahweh had returned in Jesus Christ, in the resurrected Christ. All of this became a part of Paul's reflective praxis in forming his Christology. So Professor Wright wants to tell us that and teach us that this new thing that we need to discover as the key element here is that Paul did not separate Christology and eschatology. He did not separate them into two independent doctrines. They were interrelated and interpenetrating doctrines, and therefore Paul's Christology is an eschatology abbreviated under his monotheism, with the direction of wisdom, because the early existing Christology was one of centered around the concept of wisdom. But for Paul, this wisdom has a direction. It has a direction toward the doxa glory of Jesus Christ as Kyrios Lord, the revealer of the doxa glory of the one true God, of monotheism. And that brings us to a look at his eschatological noema design for his Christology in the Triad on the right. And we begin with that wisdom Christology in the early church. And that was based on an Exodus hope, that a hope that there was the return to Zion of the lordship of the one true God in Jesus Christ. It was a wisdom through wisdom, Torah under Judaic faith, or aletheia, truth in New Covenant faith. So it was an eschatology of the divine truth. Christ was understood as the apocalyptic unveiling of the aletheia truth of the living God. And a new Exodus had been secured through the resurrected Christ, because Christ as coming Messianic King is the Christ who came in wisdom, but not a static concept of wisdom, but instead an eschatological movement of wisdom toward God's kingdom, the truth of God's kingdom. Remember, Christ said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. That's the eschatology Paul is positing in his Christology. There's a movement of truth and life toward the doxa glory of God. So it's critical that we understand this in this wisdom Christology that did exist. And Paul abbreviated 7 sub-concepts under this eschatological wisdom. Exodus, of course, redemption and the renewal of all creation, the tabernacling presence of God through indwelling spirit, the return of the doxa glory, and wisdom itself, and the kingship of Christ as Kyrios Lord. So Professor Wright tells us that if you want to capture it in a triad, simply identify Paul's early Christology as Exodus, return, and wisdom. Exodus, return, and wisdom as a fluid eschatology, is a dynamic, spirit-driven, spirit-filled eschatology. They're not separate doctrines. And Paul did take up the Yahweh is Lord relational concept and applied it to Christ as Kyrios Lord. So in Block 2, we'd look at these relational aspects. Relation as Exodus, relation as returning doxa, relation as the movement of wisdom and truth toward God's kingdom. And Paul writes his very first Christology in Galatians 4, 1 through 11. It's his first Christology as a Exodus eschatological narrative. When the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son. The sovereign God liberates the enslaved creation to sin. And it's a new Exodus liberation as an eschatological directing liberation. It includes the promise of God's personal presence as what Paul says is being known by God. If we are in the Messiah, we are known by God through his indwelling Spirit, which is an ongoing eschatological reality. It's an already aspect of the kingdom. It's both an already and a not yet because there's more to be revealed, more to be disclosed, but it is an already existing presence of Jesus Christ. But believers are on their way to inheritance, and Paul petitions and appeals to the believers, don't return to your previous enslavement to sin. So in Paul's Christology, his relational Christology, Jesus brought the full revelation of God, and being known by God means that God himself initiated the relation of knowing. Ecclesia becomes the new Israel and is designated God's Son, God's corporate Son. Jesus is the Davidic Messiah, as he was understood also as the incarnate one who was incarnately moving creation in an eschatological way toward new creation. Christ is the agent of new creation through incarnate eschatological empowerment and movement toward doxa glory. This is so critical to understand here that eschatology and Christology are interpenetrating doctrines for Paul. Extremely important. Christ is the incarnate one as a movement of truth and wisdom, and he definitely did look at Christ as the embodiment of the one true monotheistic God of faith. He is the full embodiment of the one true living God. And he is moving God's kingdom toward the eschaton. Therefore, Paul's Christology must be eschatology. Let's take a look at the block 3 on the right. It is Exodus-shaped, it is eschatological, it is monotheistic. It's 4 movements. It's a movement toward the inheritance in Romans 8. It is a movement within the freedom and liberation of the law of spirit in Romans 8. It's guided by the unfolding of aletheia truth. Christ is the truth. He is the way. It's guided by this wisdom in Christ, also in Romans 8. And Paul, in his eschatological Christology, says it's a movement in 10 aspects. Paul posits the goodness of creation through Christ. He posits the end apocalyptic age as already inaugurated in Christ. He posits a realized freedom in Christ. And he posits the exhortation to be loyal to and worship Christ in a prayer of loyalty. He rereads Deuteronomy 6, the Shema prayer of monotheism, and he says that the one God that is fully incarnate in Christ leads to a one ecclesia community without distinction. We are invoked by the klesis call of Christ to respond in allegiance and commitment and discipleship as we move toward the aletheia truth as an eschatological movement of the way, the truth, and the life in Jesus Christ. We are in a movement toward the way, the truth, and the life, which has been an imprinted revision of the already existing wisdom Christology of the early church. Paul didn't let it remain static. He made it dynamic and eschatological. He imprinted it with Exodus to depict liberation in Christ, and everything came together in what happens to be a powerful understanding and a new teaching by Professor Wright that Paul's Christology is not separated from Paul's eschatology. They are not 2 separate doctrines in the Apostle Paul. That'll wrap up this lesson. We will also have our recall triad.